Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander, episode 26, All in the Family. Last time, we saw Antiochus win a victory over the Gauls by means of his 16 Indian war elephants, which eventually saw the Gauls settling in the region of Galatia. The 19th century historian George Rawlinson felt that the invasion of the Gauls and a mostly unsuccessful series of campaigns against them meant that Antiochus' power in Anatolia was crippled, meaning he ultimately lost control of Galatia and the region of Pergamon. However, we do have to acknowledge that he had won a victory and forced the Gauls to settle down in one region, rather than rampaging across the peninsula. This victory means that we're able to pan out from Anatolia again, and focus on the geopolitical squabbling between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. This doesn't mean that there aren't still other factions to discuss, primarily the Antigonids, but the bickering between the Ptolemies and Seleucids is going to be the backdrop to everything else. However, we're going to leave that aside for a little while because, as promised, today we're going to catch up with what the Antigonids have been doing while we've been distracted by the fighting of the other major powers. So, just to quickly recap. We left off the story of the Antigonids with the capture of Demetrius I by Seleucus. Even after having surrendered himself to Seleukos, Demetrius had showed a loyalty to his son and a desire to make sure his family continued to do well, because upon his capture, he had written a letter to Antigonus II and to his commanders in Corinth and Athens, stating that they must treat him as dead from this point on and ignore any letters they might receive from him. Presumably, he was anticipating exactly the sort of meddling that Seleucus had been planning before his captive unexpectedly died by drinking in 283 at the age of 55. It should be noted that Antigonus II had written to Seleucus, and indeed to other powers, offering up all his territory, or even himself as a hostage in return for his father's release. However, Seleucus had refused. With the death of Demetrius I as a Seleukid captive, the Antigonid fortunes had essentially collapsed for a second time. As far as I am able to make out, Pyrrhus and Lysimachus had essentially divided Macedon between them, with Antigonus II being pushed out of the picture. He was, essentially, limited to a few cities in Greece, which then acted as his power base. Upon his father's death, Antigonus II assumed the title of King of Macedon. However, for reasons we'll see in a moment, he wouldn't actually begin his regnal count until the year 276 BCE. As we saw in previous episodes, Antigonus saw his chance to retake his kingdom after Seleucus was assassinated in September of 281. He accordingly marched north with his army from Greece, but was defeated by the usurper Ptolemy the Thunderbolt and forced to flee back south again. Antigonus would play a role in the defence of Greece when the Gauls invaded, as Antiochus did, as we saw in episode 24. He played a relatively minor role, as it was apparently the Aetolians who did most of the legwork in defending Greece following the invasion in 279. As we saw, the Gauls were decisively defeated at Thermopylae and Delphi, essentially forcing them to withdraw again. However, this same invasion by the Gauls had also plunged Macedon back into chaos again, with the death of Ptolemy the Thunderbolt in battle. His death followed a series of miscalculations or otherwise arrogant decisions on the part of Caraunus. 2 years of chaos would accordingly follow in Macedon, with a series of kings essentially entering and exiting through a revolving door. In 277 BCE, Antigonus saw his chance and landed near Lysimachia, where Seleucus had been assassinated. A group of Gauls appeared nearby, commanded by yet another commander called Cerithrius. Antigonus hid his men and abandoned his camp, which immediately meant that the Gauls started to loot it. They made to attack the ships he had used to land, but at this point his plan sprang into action, his army re-emerged and trapped them between their weapons and the sea. The subsequent Battle of Lysimachia was a resounding success for the Antigonids, and, in the wake of this, Antigonus II would go on to successfully claim the throne of Macedon. From this point on, the picture would essentially solidify, with three main players taking part in our story in the West right until the end at the hands of the Romans. Specifically, they are the Antigonids in Greece and Macedon, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and the Seleucids in the East. That's not to say there won't be a fair bit of jockeying for position and territory changing hands, but the overall dynastic picture has largely calcified. Amidst all of these good omens, his wife Phila gave birth to his son and heir, Demetrius II. Now, I can already hear some of you asking, who is this Phila and why hasn't she been mentioned before? Well, some of you might have spotted that this name Phila has cropped up once before. She is, in fact, the only child of Seleucus I by his second marriage to Stratonice, making her both the half-sister and now stepdaughter of Antiochus I. This also makes her the niece of her husband Antigonus II, but we'll skip lightly over that one. To understand why this marriage alliance occurred, it might be useful to turn to another quote from Edwin Bevan. Quote, "If these powers grouped themselves into two opposing camps, it meant that two of them must gravitate together against the third." End quote. This is borne out in the close friendship between the Antigonids and the Seleucids during this time. After all, one or both of them will be more or less continually at war with Egypt during this period. The first roots of this alliance came with the marriage between Seleucus and Stratonice in 299 BCE at Rhosus, and continued with her subsequent marriage to Antiochus I in or around 294. At this point, in the early 270s, Seleucus' daughter Phila was approaching the age when she could be married. I can't find an exact birth date for her, but the narrow range of dates between Stratonice's two marriages mean that Phila will have been born sometime in the early 290s, meaning she was now probably approaching her late teens or early 20s. Now, there's a bit of a discrepancy between the sources I've been accessing so far. Bevan notes that Phila was sent to be married to Antigonus just after he took the Macedonian throne. However, the more detailed narrative which I just drew upon relies they must have been married before he ascended to kingship. Whichever way it happened, Phila was married to Antigonus, in a ceremony apparently distinguished for the sheer number of philosophers and thinkers that Antigonus II called together for the event. Stratonice's grandson Demetrius II was born probably around 275. Although Wikipedia lists it as definitely 275, the fact that Antigonus' kingship started in 276, as you can see from his regnal year decision, this might mean he was born sometime around then, given that Demetrius was listed as being born shortly after his father's takeover of Macedon. For the sake of our narrative, I'm going to go with the date I've been shown and say 275. This is where we'll leave the Antigonid narrative again for now. We'll come back to it as we continue our story, but I think we're all caught up again for now where we need to be. On another note, these lines of descent from other houses through female lines do seem to have been noted and important to the Hellenistic kings. For example, as we'll cover again next episode, one of Ptolemy II's children will be called Lysimachus, named for his maternal grandfather. Added to that, we'll see the classically Antigonid names of Demetrius and Philip diffuse into the Seleukid royal family in later generations. Bevan also notes that the name Antigonus appears in a member of the House of Seleucus, but so far, at least, I've been unable to locate the individual he's referring to. This alliance with the Antigonids would have been important in the Seleucids' enmity with the Ptolemies. Ptolemy II was in a powerful position which the other two powers would have been nervous of. After all, Egypt was fabulously wealthy without being so spread out as the Seleukid realms, and this smaller area allowed it to be centralised far more easily. This by itself would not have been a problem if Egypt had simply kept to Egypt. However, as we've seen time again and again in previous episodes, Egypt had a powerful navy. Alexandria was a perfect harbour, and the rest of Egypt's relatively short coastline was dotted with lagoons which could presumably house its navy, a navy unmatched throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Timber was not something Egypt itself possessed in any great amount, but Cyprus, coastal Anatolia and South Lebanon had enough of it for all of their needs. And so we come to a subject I've been leaving comparatively to one side so far to simplify our story, the Ptolemaic Empire beyond Egypt. We've already come across its control over Cyprus, Cyrenaica and southern Syria, but there were other areas under their sway too. Ptolemy I had first started this overseas empire off by bringing Cyprus definitively back under Egyptian sway in 294, as well as creating the pro-Ptolemaic Confederation of the Cyclades. Incidentally, the Cyclades refers to the smattering of Greek islands to the north of Crete. The next phase of empire building would undoubtedly have come under Ptolemy II, when hostilities, inevitably, rekindled with the Seleucids. To explain what had exactly caused this hostility, we need to refer back to Apama, the daughter of Antiochus and Stratonice. In 275, when she was approximately 17, she had been married off to her maternal third cousin Magas, the viceroy of Cyrenaica and the maternal half-brother of Ptolemy II. If you'll recall, Magas was one of the 3 children of Berenike by her first marriage. The other 2 were Antigone and Theoxena, who we'll deal with quite a way down the line. Now, I called Magas a viceroy, but this isn't exactly right at this point. True, Magas had been assigned to govern Cyrenaica after the death of the previous governor when he was 20 years old. However, in 276, after the invasion of the Gauls, Magas had declared himself and his territory of Cyrenaica to be independent. We incidentally know that it happened after the Gallic invasion, as the forces of Ptolemy II sport a set of Gallic fighters, probably the same corps that Ptolemy II had given himself so much glory for taking in episode 25. Purportedly, Magas had tried several times to become independent after the death of Ptolemy I, his stepfather, before finally taking up a crown. So, Apama married Magas. It is possible that she changed her name to the more Ptolemaic Arsinoe upon her marriage, as she is sometimes known by this name. This marriage would eventually result in one daughter, Berenike II, after 270 BCE. Keep that name in mind, by the way, as she's going to crop up again down the line after about 250 BCE. After his elevation to kingship in 276, Magas turned openly hostile to Egypt. To see why this is important, you need to realise that his marriage to Apama was political as well as dynastic. Antiochus supposedly organised it in a bid to invade Egypt alongside his new son-in-law Magas. The marriage alliance was a useful pretext to avoid sitting on the fence after Magas had declared himself king, as well as serving as a good excuse to invade Egypt. I suppose that this is why it was useful to be allied to the Antigonids via marriage. After all, you don't want a hostile neighbour invading through your back door via the Hellespont if you're committed to a war to the south with Egypt. So, although relations between Antiochus I and Ptolemy II had been good upon his accession, it's nonetheless off to war we go. However, we're not quite there yet. Next time, we're going to shift focus to Egypt and see what's been going on in Alexandria and the Ptolemaic dynasty since we last checked in when Ptolemy I was still in charge. In the meantime, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.